In the summer of 1942, as the world burned under the weight of war, an entire U.S. Army convoy rolled out of a coastal base and disappeared. Dozens of men, trucks loaded with classified cargo, and orders stamped with the highest level of secrecy, all gone without a trace. Families waited for letters that never came. Officers whispered in closed rooms but signed papers declaring the mission erased. For 50 years the earth held its silence, swallowing steel, rubber and human stories that no one dared to ask about again. Until now. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more untold historical stories. Daniel Harris had grown up listening to his grandfather's war stories at the family porch in New Orleans. Those humid evenings carried the smell of magnolia trees and the sound of crickets humming in the dark. His grandfather, James Harris, never told him about victories or medals. He spoke about men, ordinary soldiers, their fears, their loyalties, and their regrets. Daniel learned early that history wasn't just in textbooks, it lived in the memories of those who had carried its burden. By 1992, Daniel was 28, freshly graduated in journalism but restless. He wanted more than local stories about council meetings or fishing regulations. He craved something that mattered, something that would honor the silences he had grown up around. His grandfather had passed away just 3 years earlier, leaving Daniel with a leather-bound notebook of fragmented recollections. Among them, a single sentence had haunted him. Some convoys never reached their shores, Daniel. Some truths sank into the mud, and the world moved on. That phrase echoed inside him when he received a phone call from a retired history professor named Thomas Greer. Greer's voice was raspy, weakened by age but urgent. "Mr. Harris, I've read some of your columns. You look for what others ignore. That's why I'm calling. Did you ever hear about the convoy that vanished in 42? Daniel froze at the words. His grandfather's sentence surfaced instantly, like a ghost tugging at him. "I've heard rumors," Daniel said carefully, gripping the receiver. "They weren't just rumors," Greer replied. "Locals in the Atchafalaya Basin found something this year. Vehicles, old, military. Not wrecks scattered by accident, lined up like someone meant to leave them there. No records, no explanations." Daniel sat back, staring at the yellowed wallpaper of his small apartment. The Atchafalaya Basin was a swamp he knew only from road trips, an endless sprawl of water, cypress knees, and fog that seemed to swallow sound. To imagine army vehicles abandoned in such a place stirred both excitement and dread. "What do you think they were doing there?" Daniel asked. "I don't think," Greer answered firmly. "I know. They were hidden." He paused before adding, "And you might be the one to bring the truth back to light." That night Daniel couldn't sleep. The city outside his window carried its usual rhythm, streetcars groaning in the distance, laughter spilling from a nearby bar, a train horn echoing faintly from the river. Yet his mind raced with images of trucks half sunken in moss, crates sealed with forgotten orders, and soldiers whose names had faded from memory. He opened his grandfather's notebook again, flipping through shaky handwriting, lists of names and descriptions of faces Daniel had never met. At the back, tucked between 2 loose pages, was a sketch of trucks under palm trees, drawn with rough lines. Daniel stared at it for a long time, tracing the shapes with his finger, wondering if his grandfather had known more than he ever admitted. By morning, Daniel had made his decision. The world might have forgotten the convoy of 42, but he would not. With a notebook, a recorder, and the stubborn fire that had carried him through restless nights, he began to plan his first trip into the swamp. He didn't yet know what awaited him, only that silence had lasted long enough. The truth, whatever it was, would not remain buried. The call from Professor Greer lingered in Daniel's mind for days, gnawing at him as he tried to keep pace with the ordinary rhythm of his work. At the newsroom of the New Orleans Daily Tribune, the air was thick with the smell of ink and cigarette smoke, and the chatter was mostly about the mayor's latest infrastructure promises. Daniel typed up a short piece on zoning disputes, but his thoughts drifted back to the words, "Vehicles hidden Atchafalaya Basin." By late afternoon, he couldn't stand it anymore. He picked up the phone and dialed Greer's number. The old professor answered almost immediately, as if he had been waiting by the receiver. "I can't stop thinking about what you told me," Daniel confessed. "If these vehicles are real, if they're Army issue from the 40s, then this isn't just a local oddity. It's history buried alive." "I knew you'd understand," Greer replied. "But be warned, son. This isn't a story you'll find in tidy archives. The Army never admitted to losing that convoy. You'll be knocking on doors they don't want opened." Daniel's chest tightened. "Are you saying the government still cares after 50 years? "I'm saying silence is sometimes more powerful than memory," Greer said softly. "But if you have the courage, go see for yourself. The swamp holds its secrets, but it doesn't lie." That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at his grandfather's notebook. A storm rattled the shutters outside, rain pattering against the old wood, the smell of wet earth rising from the garden. He remembered his grandfather's voice, slow, deliberate, weighted with things unsaid. He had always sensed there were stories locked behind those pauses. Now, for the first time, Daniel felt he had a chance to pull one into the light. He jotted down a list: recorder, notebook, boots, maps. The decision had already been made in his heart. He wasn't going to let this lead slip away. The next morning he paid a visit to the New Orleans Public Library, a towering structure of stone and stained glass that smelled of paper and polish. Among the quiet aisles, he found Evelyn Carter, an archivist he had spoken to once before for a different article. She was in her early 30s, her dark hair tied back neatly, her expression calm but sharp. "Back so soon, Harris?" she asked with a half-smile, adjusting her glasses. "I need help with something unusual," Daniel admitted. "Records from 1942. Specifically convoy movements that might have passed through Louisiana." Evelyn frowned, lowering her voice. "That's not a casual request. Military documents from that period are often sealed, sometimes even missing. That's why I'm asking you," he said. "You know where to look when others don't." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're chasing something dangerous, aren't you?" "I don't know yet," Daniel answered honestly, "but I can't ignore it." Evelyn led him through the back corridors, past shelves filled with dust-covered ledgers. She unlocked a cabinet with careful hands. Inside were shipping manifests, troop movement logs and requisition orders, neat columns of ink telling stories most had forgotten. Together they combed through the papers. After hours of silence broken only by the rustle of pages, Evelyn found something odd. Here, a transport record marked Coastal Supply Unit 14. Departure confirmed. No arrival listed. The entry ends abruptly. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. That has to be them. Evelyn shook her head. Or it could be a clerical error. But she hesitated, then added, "There's a note in the margin. Restricted. Further inquiry not advised." That's not standard. He closed the folder gently, feeling both exhilaration and unease. The Army wasn't just silent. It had deliberately erased a trail. Walking out into the humid afternoon, Daniel realized he was standing on the edge of something larger than he had imagined. The swamp was calling, and with it the weight of his grandfather's unspoken truth. The journey was no longer just an idea, it was a necessity. The more Daniel dug, the heavier the air seemed to grow around him. That evening, he sat in his apartment with the windows open, the sounds of New Orleans seeping in from the street below, horns blaring, laughter from a nearby diner, the distant rumble of the riverboats. Yet none of it reached him. His mind was consumed by the thin folder Evelyn had risked handing over. Inside were gaps, redactions, and the strangest silences he had ever seen on official documents. It wasn't absence that unsettled him, but the presence of deliberate erasure. He traced his fingers over the words, restricted, further inquiry not advised. His grandfather's voice came back to him again, low and grave. Some truths sank into the mud. Sleep did not come easily that night. When he finally closed his eyes, his dreams carried him to another time. He saw rows of military trucks rumbling along a dirt road, their engines groaning under heavy loads. Soldiers in dust-covered uniforms shifted in their seats, their faces shadowed with exhaustion. The landscape was not Louisiana. It was an island in the Pacific, thick with jungle and humidity that clung like a second skin. One young soldier's face became clear to him in the dream, eyes wide, jaw tense, hands gripping the side of the truck. Daniel woke with a start, sweat dampening his sheets. The image lingered, so vivid it felt more memory than dream. The next morning, he carried the documents back to Evelyn. She looked at him with cautious eyes as he spread them on the table. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" he asked. Evelyn pursed her lips. "I've seen missing files, yes, but notes warning archivists not to inquire? That's different. It means someone at some point feared the truth more than the lie." Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady but intense. "I need to know what they were carrying. This wasn't just routine supply work." They went to great lengths to make sure no trace remained. Evelyn hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I might be able to access some sealed materials, but if I do, you have to promise me something. You won't mention my name to anyone, not even if you're pressured." "You have my word," Daniel said. She nodded. "Give me time." Leaving the library, Daniel felt both gratitude and unease. He knew Evelyn was risking her career, maybe more, by helping him. That trust bound him tighter to the pursuit. Later that day, Daniel sought out Professor Greer again. The old man welcomed him into his modest home, filled with books stacked on every surface, maps pinned to walls and photographs curling at the edges. The professor's hands trembled as he poured 2 cups of coffee. "So," Greer said, his eyes sharp despite his frailty, "what have you found?" "Not enough," Daniel admitted, "but enough to know they wanted this story buried." Greer gave a dry laugh. "Of course they did. Wars aren't just fought overseas, Harris. They're fought in the shadows of paper trails and whispered orders." Daniel leaned forward. "Do you know what was in those trucks?" Greer didn't answer immediately. He stared into his coffee, then said, "Rumors only. Some say experimental equipment, others insist it was chemical stock. But the strangest whisper was that it wasn't the cargo at all. It was the men. Soldiers who knew too much, sent away and erased." The words chilled Daniel more than he expected. To vanish equipment was one thing, to vanish men was another. He thought of his grandfather's stories again, fragments of unease, mentions of friends who never came back. As Daniel walked home through the damp streets, the city lights reflected in puddles left by afternoon rain. He knew he was inching closer to something dangerous, a truth coiled tightly, waiting. The swamp lay ahead, and with it the weight of secrets too long buried. The Atchafalaya Basin stretched before Daniel like another world, an endless maze of cypress trees, roots twisting out of dark water, and air so thick with humidity it clung to his skin. He had driven west from New Orleans, leaving behind the clamor of the city for this sprawling wilderness that locals often described with a mix of pride and fear. It was here, in this swamp larger than some states, that whispers of the lost convoy had resurfaced. Daniel knew he couldn't venture into such a place alone. Through Greer's connections, he was introduced to Robert "Bobby" LeBlanc, a Cajun fisherman whose family had lived on the edges of the swamp for generations. Bobby met him at a small dock, leaning casually against his boat, a cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes sharp beneath a weathered cap. "You the reporter?" Bobby asked, his accent thick, each word drawn out like slow music. "Yeah," Daniel replied, gripping his notebook tightly. "I hear you know these waters better than anyone." Bobby chuckled. "No, I'm sure. But that don't mean I trust 'em. The swamp'll turn on you quick if you don't show respect." Daniel studied him, sensing both confidence and caution in the man. "Then I'll follow your lead." They pushed off into the basin, the motor growling before Bobby cut it back, letting the boat glide between towering cypress. Spanish moss hung low, brushing Daniel's shoulders as they passed. The air smelled of damp earth and brackish water, rich and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, an alligator splashed, sending ripples across the surface. "So what's got you poking around out here?" Bobby asked, steering the boat through a narrow channel. Daniel hesitated, then answered honestly. "A convoy from World War II disappeared. Locals say pieces of it were found in these swamps. I want to know if it's true." Bobby spat into the water. "Lot of things get lost out here, boats, hunters, even whole family stories. But army trucks, that's something else. They say you've seen..." Signs, Daniel pressed. Bobby's eyes flicked toward him. I've seen metal where metal shouldn't be. Rusted shapes under the waterline. Things you don't expect in God's swamp. But folks around here don't like talking about it. Outsiders dig too deep and trouble follows. Daniel felt a chill despite the heat pressing against his skin. Trouble from who? Could be the swamp. Could be people who'd rather the past stayed put, Bobby said simply, pushing the boat harder through the reeds. They stopped near a cluster of old shacks on stilts, where a handful of locals sat on porches, eyes following them with suspicion. Daniel felt the weight of their stares. One man muttered something in Cajun French, shaking his head. Bobby gave a curt nod but didn't stop. Don't mind 'em, Bobby murmured. They don't trust anyone asking questions. Swamp folk keep to themselves. Been that way forever. Daniel jotted notes, his hand sweating against the paper. He realized how out of place he must look here, in pressed clothes and polished shoes, while Bobby moved with the ease of someone who belonged. They pushed deeper, where the trees grew denser and the water darker. Dragonflies buzzed above and herons lifted off in slow, deliberate arcs. Daniel's nerves stretched thin with every sound, but Bobby remained calm, guiding them with instinct. After hours of winding paths, Bobby cut the engine and let the boat drift. The silence was so complete, Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. From here, Bobby said quietly, we go on foot. That's where the ground starts telling its stories. Daniel tightened the straps of his bag, swallowing hard. The swamp wasn't just a backdrop now. It was a test, alive and watching, daring him to continue. He stepped onto the soft earth, sinking slightly into the mud. Each step forward felt like crossing a threshold into a place where secrets clung to the air, waiting to be unearthed. The swamp grew darker as Daniel and Bobby pressed on, each step muffled by the thick mud beneath their boots. Mosquitoes swarmed in relentless clouds, and the dense canopy let only shards of sunlight through, casting the ground in shifting patches of light and shadow. Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead, his notebook clutched tightly to his chest. He felt as if the swamp itself were testing his resolve, each mile demanding patience, endurance, and trust in the man leading the way. Bobby stopped abruptly, raising a hand for silence. Daniel froze, heart pounding. For a moment all he heard was the faint drip of water and the low buzz of insects. Then, in the stillness, he noticed something unnatural, a glint of rusted metal half swallowed by moss and vines. There, Bobby whispered, pointing. Daniel's breath caught. He pushed past a curtain of hanging moss and saw it clearly. The rounded hood of an army truck, its olive paint eaten away by decades of rain and heat, its frame sagging but unmistakable. The vehicle leaned into the earth as though the swamp had tried to consume it, but still it stood, silent and defiant against time. My God, Daniel murmured, stepping closer. His fingers brushed the corroded surface, and he felt a shiver run through him. This wasn't rumor anymore, it was real. Bobby moved cautiously around the vehicle, kicking at the mud to reveal part of a tire rim. "'Tain't no accident this thing's here," he said firmly. "Look at the fuel tank drained, and the engine. Parts are gone. Somebody didn't just leave it. They stripped it." Daniel crouched, scribbling notes, his heart racing. So they stopped here on purpose. But why hide the trucks instead of taking them back? "That's the question, isn't it?" Bobby muttered, scanning the shadows as if expecting someone to appear. They pushed further into the undergrowth, and within minutes, more shapes emerged. Another truck, then a third. Each was positioned carefully side by side as though the convoy had been deliberately arranged. The jungle of vines wrapped around them like chains, nature doing its part to erase their presence. Daniel ran his hand along the side of one truck and noticed faint stenciling beneath the rust. U.S. Army property. His pulse quickened at the sight. "They really were here," he whispered. "An entire convoy abandoned in the middle of Louisiana." Bobby's gaze narrowed. And yet no bodies, no crates, no sign of what they were carrying, just the bones of the machines. Daniel climbed onto the nearest truck, the metal groaning under his weight. From the driver's seat, he could see the cracked remains of the windshield, a steering wheel coated in mildew, and on the floor, half buried under leaves, a waterlogged notebook. He pulled it out carefully, The cover nearly dissolved, but pages still intact, though blurred by time. "What you got there?" Bobby called. Daniel held it up. "A soldier's journal, maybe." He flipped through, finding entries smudged but legible enough to catch fragments. Orders, secrecy, crates, no questions allowed. His hands trembled as he read. The voice of a long-forgotten soldier, suddenly reaching him across 5 decades. He tucked the fragile notebook carefully into his bag, realizing its worth. It wasn't just evidence of the trucks, but of the men who had driven them, their fear and confusion preserved in ink. Bobby climbed onto the second truck and spat into the mud. Whoever left these behind wanted them hidden good, and it worked. Took 50 years for someone to stumble back here. Daniel looked at the row of rusting vehicles, his chest heavy with both triumph and dread. The discovery was monumental, but it left more questions than answers. Why had the army erased this? What had been inside those sealed crates? As the weight of the find pressed on him, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The swamp had given up one secret, but countless more waited in the shadows, demanding to be uncovered. Back at his small apartment in New Orleans, Daniel sat hunched over the soldier's notebook, the smell of damp pages filling the room. He had spread it across his desk with the care of an archaeologist, using a lamp angled low to bring out the faded ink. Every word mattered. Each half-legible sentence felt like a breath rising from the swamp itself, pulling him deeper into a story that had been buried for half a century. The handwriting was uneven, sometimes hurried, sometimes steady. One entry caught his attention. "We've been ordered not to ask about the crates. Captain says they're marked for transfer only, no matter what. Men are uneasy. They whisper at night." Daniel leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. The lines were mundane in one sense, but their weight pressed on him. Soldiers trained for war rarely wrote about fear in this way. Fear was supposed to be a silent companion, not spilled onto paper. He turned the page and another fragment emerged through the blurred ink. "We stopped again today." Captain argued with another officer. Men overheard words like diversion and change of orders. No explanations. Spirits low. Daniel rubbed his temples, a mixture of exhilaration and frustration tightening his chest. There were answers here, but also more shadows. He needed help to decipher the gaps. He needed Evelyn. When he brought the notebook to her the next morning, she handled it delicately, as if afraid it might crumble in her hands. They sat in a quiet reading room of the library, sunlight cutting across rows of shelves. Evelyn adjusted her glasses, scanning the pages. "This is extraordinary," she whispered. "Do you realize what you have here? First-hand testimony from one of the men who vanished. If this is authentic, it changes everything." Daniel nodded, his voice low. "It proves the trucks weren't abandoned by chance. They were following orders, orders that made no sense." Evelyn frowned, tracing her finger across the blurred ink. "The language here, diversion, change of orders, suggests a mission deliberately altered, but the secrecy about the crates, that's unsettling. What could they have been carrying that even the soldiers weren't allowed to know?" "That's what I intend to find out," Daniel said firmly. For the first time, Evelyn's expression shifted from professional curiosity to worry. She closed the notebook gently and looked him in the eye. "Daniel, you need to be careful. This isn't just history anymore. If the army went to such lengths to bury this, then people alive today may still want it hidden." Her warning struck him harder than he expected. He thought of the trucks, arranged almost ceremoniously in the swamp, their engines stripped, their fuel tanks emptied with precision. It hadn't been an accident. Someone had made the decision to leave them there, to let the swamp become their coffin. That night, Daniel dreamed again. He saw soldiers gathered around campfires, their faces tense as they whispered in low voices. He could almost hear the words, men questioning orders, wondering why their convoy never moved toward its intended destination. Then the dream shifted. A voice, stern and commanding, barked, "Do not open the crates. Do not question. Obey." Daniel jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his grandfather's notebook lying open on the nightstand beside him as if it too had been listening. The soldier's diary had given him fragments but no full story. Yet even those fragments made one truth undeniable. The men of the convoy had been silenced, not by fate or accident, but by command. And now, 50 years later, their voices had begun to rise again, carried by the echoes of ink and rust, demanding to be heard. Daniel's story was no longer confined to notebooks and forgotten trucks. The moment he began piecing together fragments from the soldier's diary with Evelyn's research, he felt the shift, like a door had opened, and something on the other side had noticed. It started with the phone calls. At first, a single ring in the middle of the night. When he answered, there was nothing but silence. Then, 2 nights later, another call. This time a man's voice, low and calm. "Stop digging." The line went dead before Daniel could reply. He tried to brush it off as a prank, but unease clung to him. By the 3rd call, when the same voice said, "The swamp has already buried them. Don't let it bury you too," the warning was impossible to ignore. Daniel carried this tension into his next meeting with Evelyn. She noticed his distracted gaze as he laid the diary on the table. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she remarked. "I haven't," he admitted. "Someone's been calling me. No name, no number, just threats." Her brows furrowed. "That's exactly what I was afraid of. If they know what you're looking into, they won't let it slide." "But that only proves I'm on the right track," Daniel said, his voice sharper than he intended. "If this were just a dead end, no one would care enough to scare me off." Evelyn leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Daniel, obsession won't protect you. You have to think about what you're risking. Your job, your safety." She hesitated, then added softly, "Your family." Her words hit deeper than he expected. He pictured his grandfather, gone now, and his mother, who still worried every time Daniel took on a story bigger than himself. He forced a breath. "I can't walk away, Evelyn. If these men were silenced, if their families never learned the truth, then someone has to give it back to them." Later that evening, Daniel met Bobby again at the docks. The fisherman leaned against his boat, chewing on a toothpick, eyes narrowed at the sight of Daniel's weary face. "You look like hell," Bobby muttered. "Swamp ain't even finished with you and you're already spooked." Daniel gave a tired laugh. "People don't want me asking questions. Calls in the night, warnings." Bobby's expression hardened. "Ain't surprised. Folks been keeping this quiet for 50 years. You stir mud that old, it ain't just gators you're gonna find." "Are you telling me to stop too?" Daniel asked. Bobby shook his head. "Nah. I just want you to know the current you're swimming in. Me, I don't scare easy, but you carrying the weight of ghosts and men in suits. You gotta decide if you can handle both." Daniel stared at the water, dark and rippling under the moonlight. The swamp seemed alive, as though it too carried secrets waiting to surface. That night, back in his apartment, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the soldier's diary once more. He flipped to the last legible page he had translated with Evelyn's help. The final entry he could read clearly made his blood run cold. "We've been told the mission has changed. Some men want to leave, but the captain said we must obey. I fear we won't be going home." Daniel closed the notebook, his jaw tight. Every discovery pulled him further into the story, but also closer to those who wanted it, kept in the shadows. The silence pressing in from all sides was no accident. It was deliberate, calculated and dangerous. And now it was coming for him. Daniel's footsteps echoed in the marble hall of the library as he approached Evelyn's office. He carried the soldier's notebook under his arm, his mind heavy with the threats he'd received. He needed her expertise now more than ever, but when she looked up at him, something was different. Her usual calm curiosity had been replaced by guarded hesitation. "I shouldn't be here," she said before he could speak. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean? We've come this far together. I need your help." Evelyn closed the file she'd been working on, her fingers trembling slightly. "Someone came by yesterday. They asked about you, not by name, but I knew who they meant. Men in suits, not librarians or historians. They wanted to know what you were digging into." The words tightened Daniel's chest. "What did you tell them?" "I said nothing, but Daniel—" She shook her head, eyes full of worry. "This is bigger than I realized. I can't risk my career, or worse, for a story that might never see the light of day." He felt as though the floor shifted beneath him. "So that's it? You're walking away?" "I don't want to," Evelyn said softly, "but I have to protect myself. You should too." Her words cut deep, but Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded, tucking the notebook back under his arm. As he left the library, he felt the sting of betrayal, not because Evelyn had turned against him, but because she had been forced into fear. That evening, he met Bobby at the dock. The fisherman was repairing a net, his hands working steadily, though his eyes studied Daniel with quiet intensity. "You look like a man who just lost a friend," Bobby remarked. "Not lost," Daniel said, sitting down heavily. "But I can't count on her anymore. She's scared. Someone pressured her." Bobby nodded slowly. "Not surprised. Folks around here been whispering." "Word travels fast in small places. Some say a reporter's been asking questions that ought to stay buried." Daniel looked up sharply. "They mean me?" "Course they do, and some of the locals ain't too happy about it. Saw a man yesterday who spat on the ground when your name came up. Said you were stirring up old ghosts." The words carried a chill. Daniel could picture the suspicious stares he'd felt in the swamp community, the way conversations had fallen silent when he walked past. He had ignored it then, but now it pressed on him like a weight. "Why would they care?" Daniel asked. "These trucks have been rotting in the swamp for 50 years. What harm is there in knowing the truth?" Bobby gave him a long look. "'Cause truth don't just belong to the past. It changes the present. Some folks built lives on silence. You break it, and suddenly everything they thought safe ain't safe no more." Daniel rubbed his forehead, exhaustion settling in. He wanted to believe the truth was always worth the fight, but doubt gnawed at him. What if Evelyn was right? What if the story never saw daylight, and all he accomplished was putting the people around him in danger? Bobby slapped the net against the dock, startling Daniel out of his thoughts. "Listen, Harris. You came here for answers. You found trucks, journals, whispers that don't add up. That's more than most ever see. But you got to decide, are you going to stop here or are you going to keep walking into the dark?" Daniel met Bobby's steady gaze. The fisherman's words carried no judgment, only challenge. And deep down, Daniel knew there was no turning back. The silence pressing around him was proof enough that the truth mattered. Still, the road ahead was no longer lit by trust. He would have to move forward carrying the weight of doubt on his shoulders, unsure of who would stand with him or against him when the next secret surfaced. The rain came heavy that night, pounding against Daniel's apartment windows as thunder rolled over New Orleans. He sat at his desk, the soldier's journal open in front of him, its words blurred in the lamplight. His notes scattered across the table, forming a messy patchwork of questions without answers. He knew he couldn't keep circling the same fragments forever. He needed more. The next morning, he returned to Professor Greer's modest home. The old man greeted him with a tired smile, ushering him into a room that smelled of old books and pipe smoke. Maps covered the walls, pins marking battle sites across the Pacific. "You look restless," Greer said, pouring coffee into chipped mugs. "I am," Daniel admitted. "The trucks were drained, engines stripped. The journal mentions crates no one could open, orders no one understood. This wasn't supply work, it was something else entirely." "I need to know what." Greer lowered himself into his chair, his joints stiff. "There were whispers during the war. I heard them from men who served near the coast. They spoke of shipments no one could explain, crates marked government property, guarded tighter than gold. Some believed they held experimental equipment. Radar components, perhaps, or chemicals meant to test new weapons." Daniel frowned, scribbling in his notebook. "So the cargo was valuable enough to hide, but dangerous enough to erase from the record." "Exactly," Greer replied. "And if sabotage was involved, it means someone inside the army didn't want it reaching its destination. That kind of betrayal would have been buried deep." The word sabotage rattled in Daniel's chest. He thought of the convoy sitting in the swamp, lined up like relics abandoned on command. So the disappearance wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Greer leaned forward, his eyes sharp despite the years. "You're chasing a story that could rewrite part of the war, Harris. But history has teeth. Be sure you're ready to be bitten." Daniel left with more determination than fear. Still, doubt gnawed at him until evening, when he received a knock at his door. Opening it, he found Evelyn standing there, soaked from the rain, her expression torn between fear and resolve. "I shouldn't be here," she said quickly, "but I can't leave it alone either. Daniel stepped aside, ushering her in. "I thought you decided it was too dangerous." "I had," Evelyn admitted, pulling the damp coat from her shoulders. "But after you left, I kept thinking about the families. If their sons disappeared without explanation, if the truth was sealed away, don't they deserve to know?" Her words struck him like a lifeline. For days he'd felt abandoned in the search, but now she stood before him, her loyalty returned. "I went back to the archives," Evelyn continued. "I shouldn't have, but I did. I found something unusual, shipping records connected to the same convoy. They were supposed to transfer equipment bound for the Pacific Theater, but the documents stopped halfway, rerouted into Louisiana." "No further record." Daniel's pulse quickened. "So they weren't just moving through Louisiana, they were diverted here, intentionally." Evelyn nodded. "And the crates? The records list them only as classified equipment, experimental, no details. But the fact they were rerouted, then erased, that's no coincidence." Daniel paced the small room, his excitement colliding with dread. "This changes everything. The convoy wasn't lost, it was silenced. And if it was sabotage, then someone high enough to alter records was pulling the strings." Evelyn met his gaze, her voice steady. "Then we need to prove it. Not just for history, but for the men whose voices were stolen." Daniel sat down, the journal still open beside him. The words blurred for a moment as emotion welled in his chest. For the first time since this began, he felt he wasn't alone in carrying the weight. And with Evelyn back at his side, the puzzle that had haunted him was beginning to take shape. Piece by piece, truth was surfacing. The swamp greeted them again with its oppressive silence, as if it knew Daniel and Bobby were trespassing into places meant to stay forgotten. This time, Evelyn had joined them, her boots sinking awkwardly into the mud. She wasn't used to this landscape, but determination steadied her steps. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, swatting at a mosquito. "No," Daniel admitted, pushing through the tall reeds. "But we can't stop halfway. If there's more out here, we need to find it." Bobby led the way, machete in hand, hacking through thick vines. His posture was tense, his eyes sweeping the tree line. "Feels different today," he muttered. "Like the swamp don't want us here." They followed a narrow path until the undergrowth gave way to another clearing. Daniel stopped short, breath catching in his throat. Before them lay more trucks, larger than the first set, their hulks twisted and blackened. The stench of old char clung to the air, faint but undeniable. Evelyn covered her mouth. They were burned. Daniel crouched near the charred remains of one vehicle, his fingers brushing over melted metal. "This wasn't nature," he said. "This was fire set deliberately." Bobby examined the ground, running his hand through the ash mixed with soil. "Long time ago, but not the swamp's work. Someone torched these." Daniel's pulse raced. The discovery wasn't just about abandonment anymore, it was destruction. Whoever had left the trucks behind hadn't been content to hide them. They'd tried to erase them. As they moved cautiously among the wrecks, the air grew heavier. The sun dimmed behind thickening clouds, and a distant rumble announced an approaching storm. Daniel felt the shift in the air, a weight pressing down as though the swamp itself were warning them away. "Let's get what we came for and move," Bobby said sharply. "I don't like the feel of this place." Daniel knelt by another truck, spotting markings half burned but still visible. Equipment unit restricted. He scribbled the details into his notebook, his mind racing with possibilities. Evelyn snapped photographs, her hands trembling despite her calm expression. Then, without warning, the wind shifted, carrying with it the acrid scent of smoke. Fresh smoke. Daniel stiffened. "Do you smell that?" Bobby's head snapped up. His eyes darted toward the tree line. A faint glow flickered through the dense foliage, and within seconds orange flames licked upward, spreading fast along the dry underbrush. "Move!" Bobby shouted, grabbing Evelyn's arm and pulling her toward the clearing's edge. Daniel stumbled after them, his chest tight with panic. The fire spread unnaturally fast, feeding on the swamp's dryness, crackling through vines and leaves. Smoke stung his eyes, clawing at his lungs. They raced along the path they had carved earlier, the glow chasing them, heat pressing against their backs. Evelyn coughed violently, and Daniel grabbed her hand, refusing to let go. His thoughts spun wildly. Was this an accident, a careless spark? Or had someone followed them, determined to finish what had been started 50 years ago? When they finally broke through the undergrowth to the boat, Daniel collapsed against the dock, chest heaving. Bobby jumped into the vessel, starting the motor with practiced speed. Flames lit the distant trees, their glow reflected on the dark water. Evelyn wiped her streaming eyes, her voice hoarse. That wasn't natural. Someone wanted us gone. Daniel gripped the side of the boat, his knuckles white. Then we're closer than I thought. Too close for someone's comfort. Bobby steered them swiftly away, his jaw set. You stirred up a nest, Harris, and now it's fighting back. Daniel stared at the flames devouring the swamp behind them. He had come searching for answers, but instead he found fire, and with it the certainty that forces far stronger than time still guarded the convoy's silence. The fire had chased them from the swamp, but Daniel's mind remained there long after. Back in his apartment, the soldier's notebook lay open on his desk, its pages warped by water and age. He had gone over it countless times, but something nagged at him. A section he hadn't examined closely enough. Late into the night, with rain hammering against the window and thunder grumbling across the city, he read again. Near the back, a page torn at the edge carried words faint but still legible, ill. His breath caught as he traced the soldier's handwriting. The captain says we will not complete the mission. He argued with Lieutenant Mallory. Men overheard talk of abandoning the trucks. Some begged to go on, others said it was madness. Orders are clear. We vanish here. If this is my last entry, may God forgive us. Daniel froze at the name, Mallory. He whispered it aloud, tasting the syllables like a key turning in a lock. His grandfather had spoken once of a Mallory, an officer he distrusted but never explained why. The entry continued, darker in tone. We are told to stay silent, even from our families. They say it is for the good of the country. I fear it is for the good of men in power. He leaned back, gripping the notebook tightly. The soldier had known. Whatever the mission was, it had ended not in battle but in betrayal. The next day Daniel showed Evelyn the passage. She read slowly, her face pale in the library's dim light. This isn't just evidence, she murmured. This is testimony, a direct link to the orders that buried those men. And Mallory, Daniel added, tapping the name. Whoever he was, he played a role in this. Evelyn closed the notebook carefully. If we can trace that name, we might be able to uncover who gave the final orders. But be careful. Names tie the past to the present, and some families guard legacies like treasure. Later, Daniel met Bobby at the docks. The fisherman sat sharpening a knife, his expression unreadable. Daniel handed him the notebook, pointing to the final entry. Bobby read silently, then spat into the water. So they were told to vanish. That's cold. Not just leaving trucks, but men too. Makes sense why you ain't finding bones, though. They probably scattered after that, living their last days in silence. Daniel shuddered. And their families never knew. Letters never came, graves never marked. Just silence. Bobby looked up, his eyes hard. You carrying their voices now, Harris, that's a heavy load. Daniel knew he was right. The diary wasn't just a relic. It was the voice of a soldier trapped between duty and betrayal. Each word pressed on him like a responsibility he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. That night, unable to sleep, Daniel remembered sitting on his grandfather's porch as a boy. James Harris had spoken of a friend who never came home, his voice breaking in a way Daniel had never forgotten. Could that friend have been tied to this convoy? Could his grandfather have carried knowledge of its disappearance all his life? The thought filled Daniel with both grief and resolve. If his grandfather had carried silence out of loyalty, then Daniel would carry truth out of justice. He returned to the diary one last time before dawn, reading the final words over and over. If this is my last entry, may God forgive us. The soldier had written not just for himself, but for the world he knew might never hear him. And now, 50 years later, Daniel was listening. The silence had been broken, but only just. The name Mallory was a thread, and Daniel was ready to follow it into the darkness it promised to reveal. The name Mallory weighed heavily on Daniel's mind, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Days of digging through public records finally gave him a lead, Colonel Richard Mallory, retired, living quietly in Washington, D.C. He was the son of Lieutenant Edward Mallory, the very name scrawled in the soldier's diary. Daniel booked a flight, his nerves taut with anticipation. Evelyn urged him to be cautious, warning that people in Mallory's position often knew how to twist the past. But Daniel was resolute. If anyone could confirm the convoy's fate, it was the man whose family had been bound to its orders. He found Mallory in a stately home shaded by oak trees, its white columns standing proud against the years. The retired colonel greeted him at the door with a practiced politeness, tall and still broad-shouldered despite his age. His grey eyes studied Daniel with sharp curiosity. "You're Harris," Mallory said, his tone carrying both recognition and suspicion. "I've read your name in the papers. You're the one stirring up stories about the old convoy." Daniel steadied his breath. "I'm not stirring up stories, Colonel. I'm uncovering facts, and your father's name is in them." Mallory led him into a wood-panelled study, lined with shelves of military history. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, offering one to Daniel before settling into a leather chair. "My father's name is in many records. He served with honor." Daniel set the soldier's diary on the table between them. "Not all records, Colonel. Some were erased, but this one survived." Mallory's expression darkened as he opened the diary, scanning the faded ink. His jaw tightened at the final entries. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of an old clock. "My father never spoke of this," Mallory said at last, his voice low. "But I knew there was something he carried, something he refused to share even with family. I see now what it was." "Then you admit it," Daniel pressed. "The convoy was abandoned on purpose, the men ordered to vanish." Mallory's gaze hardened. "What you call abandonment, my father called protection. The equipment in those crates, early radar prototypes, chemical agents still in testing, was not meant for enemy hands. There was fear of sabotage, even among our own ranks. Orders were given to prevent their arrival at the front. My father carried them out." Daniel leaned forward. "And the men? They were left behind, silenced. Their families never told the truth." Mallory's face tightened, a flicker of pain breaking through his stern composure. "Do you think my father wanted that? He lived with the weight of it until his dying day. He followed orders, as soldiers must. But he carried the guilt too. I grew up watching it eat at him." The colonel's words struck Daniel harder than he expected. He had imagined denial, perhaps even arrogance. Instead, he saw a man torn between loyalty to legacy and the shadow of shame. "So you admit the cover-up," Daniel said quietly. Mallory exhaled, staring into his glass. "Yes, it was a cover-up. But you need to understand, war is not just fought on battlefields. It's fought in decisions made in silence, where no one will ever know the names of the men who pay the price." Daniel felt anger and sorrow twist inside him. But they should know. The families deserve to hear the truth. Mallory looked up, eyes sharp again. "And if you publish it? What then? Outrage? Scandal? The tarnishing of names long dead? Will that bring those men back? Or will it only feed your ambition?" Daniel's throat tightened, but he didn't look away. "It's not about ambition, it's about giving back the voices that were stolen." The colonel studied him for a long, unflinching moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you have your truth. What you do with it is on your conscience now." Daniel left the house with the weight of Mallory's words pressing against him. The truth was his, but so was the burden. The return flight from Washington felt longer than it was. Daniel stared out the window at the patchwork of clouds, his mind replaying Colonel Mallory's words. He had wanted clear confirmation of guilt, a straightforward admission of the cover-up. Instead, he carried something heavier, a truth laced with sorrow, shame, and the echo of choices that could never be undone. When he landed in New Orleans, Evelyn was waiting for him at the terminal. She looked anxious, scanning the crowd until her eyes found his. "Well?" she asked as soon as he approached. Daniel exhaled. "It's true. Mallory admitted it, though not in the way I expected. The convoy was ordered to disappear. The trucks, the men, all of it." Evelyn's expression hardened. "Then you have what you need." "Do I?" Daniel asked quietly. "He told me it was about protecting the country, about carrying out orders no one else would. He admitted it was a cover-up, but he also called it necessary. Now I'm stuck with the truth, but it's tangled in guilt and justifications. Evelyn placed a hand on his arm. The truth doesn't have to be simple to matter. Complexity doesn't erase responsibility. They rode back to the city in silence, the streets wet from a recent storm. When Daniel arrived at his apartment, he found an envelope slid under his door. His name was typed across it in block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Stop now, last warning." He stared at the words, his pulse quickening. Someone knew he had spoken to Mallory. Someone wanted the silence preserved at all costs. Later that night, Bobby came by, stomping mud from his boots as he entered. "Heard you made it back," he said, his tone serious. "But folks are whispering more than ever. Men in black cars driving through town asking questions about you." Daniel handed him the envelope. Bobby read it, then crumpled it in his fist. "Ain't just whispers anymore. They're watching you." Evelyn spoke up from the corner of the room. "Which means you need to decide. Do you publish this story, knowing the storm it'll bring? Or do you protect yourself and bury it like everyone else has?" Daniel sat heavily at his desk, the soldier's diary, Evelyn's documents, and his notes scattered before him. He thought of the soldier's final words, of his grandfather's silence, of families who had waited decades for answers. "I can't bury it," he said at last. "If I do, then I'm no better than the ones who erased it in the first place." Evelyn nodded, her eyes full of both fear and admiration. "Then we'll do it carefully. Independent press, maybe even release it in fragments. If the big outlets refuse to touch it, we'll find another way." Bobby leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "You'll be making enemies, but you won't be standing alone." "Not while I'm breathing." Daniel looked between them, feeling the weight of their words. For weeks he had carried the burden alone, chased by silence and threats. Now, for the first time, he felt anchored, not because the danger had lessened, but because others had chosen to share it with him. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his typewriter and began to draft. The keys clacked in steady rhythm as he wrote, "In 1942, a convoy of U.S. Army trucks vanished without explanation. For 50 years, the truth was hidden until now." The story poured out of him, drawn from every note, every faded line of the soldier's journal, every word Mallory had confessed. Each sentence was a step toward breaking the silence that had bound the convoy for half a century. But even as he wrote, Daniel knew publishing would not end the fight. It would only move it from shadows into the light, where truth and silence would finally collide. The article went live on a small independent news platform late one humid evening. Daniel had debated for hours with Evelyn before clicking publish. The larger outlets wouldn't touch the story, citing lack of official confirmation and fear of legal backlash. But Daniel knew silence wasn't an option. If no one else would carry the truth, he would. Within hours, the piece spread. Messages flooded his inbox, emails from historians, veterans' families, and strangers who simply wanted to say they had always suspected something hidden. Some called him a hero. Others accused him of fabricating a conspiracy. The reactions came fast and fierce, each one a reminder that truth rarely arrived quietly. The following morning, Evelyn read through the comments aloud, her voice steady but her brow furrowed. "Listen to this one. My uncle disappeared in 1942. We were told his unit died overseas, but no body was ever found. Now, I wonder if he was one of them." Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaustion and adrenaline warring inside him. "That's why we did this. Not for headlines, but for people like that." Bobby, who had dropped by with coffee, shook his head. "And here's the other side," he said, tossing a folded newspaper onto the desk. The headline blared, "Young Reporter Spreads Unverified Claims of Army Conspiracy." Daniel stared at the article, his jaw tightening. Of course they'd try to bury it again. "They'll do more than try," Bobby warned. "You poked a hornet's nest. Don't expect the stings to stop now." As if on cue, Daniel's phone buzzed with an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A calm, clipped voice filled the line. "Mr. Harris, your article has crossed a line. Retract it, or the consequences will be yours to bear." The call ended before Daniel could speak. His hand trembled slightly as he set the phone down. Evelyn looked at him, concern etched deep in her face. "Daniel, this isn't just about history anymore. They're threatening you directly." "I know," he said quietly. "But that only proves we were right." Later that day, Daniel visited his mother. She listened as he explained everything, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Your grandfather carried secrets he never spoke," she said softly. "I used to see him staring at the river, lost in thought. Now I think I understand why. He wanted to protect us from this weight, and now you've chosen to carry it." Daniel's throat tightened. "I had to, Mom. If I stayed silent, I'd be betraying him, and the men who were erased." She placed a hand over his. "Just promise me you won't lose yourself to it. The truth is a heavy burden. Don't let it crush you." That night, Daniel walked the streets of New Orleans alone. Neon signs flickered, music drifted from bars, and the Mississippi rolled dark and steady under the moonlight. Around him, life carried on as if nothing had changed, yet inside him everything had shifted. He had published the truth, but instead of relief, he felt the full weight of responsibility pressing down. For every message of gratitude, there was a warning. For every person who believed, another demanded proof he couldn't yet provide. The silence had been broken, but at a cost that was only beginning to reveal itself. He stopped at the river's edge, staring at the black water. His grandfather's words echoed again. Some truths sank into the mud. Now Daniel had dragged those truths back into the light, and with them came the burden of carrying not just history, but the outrage, the doubt, and the danger it unleashed. The story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone willing to face it and everyone determined to fight against it. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, letters, and interviews. Some came from families who wept with gratitude, finally feeling their suspicions had been validated. Others came from officials denying everything, dismissing Daniel's work as dangerous speculation. The truth was no longer buried, but it was contested, fought over, and twisted in ways Daniel could not always control. Still, he carried on. Each word he had written, each page of the soldier's diary, had broken a silence that had lasted too long. He knew he couldn't undo the pain, but he could ensure it was no longer ignored. One cool morning, Daniel drove out to the cemetery where his grandfather was buried. The grass was damp with dew, and the air smelled of fresh rain. He carried the fragile diary with him, wrapped carefully in cloth. Kneeling at the gravestone, he laid it down gently. "You were right," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Some truths did sink into the mud, but I found them, and I told the world." He stayed there a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the wind through the trees. For the first time in weeks, he felt a measure of peace. His grandfather's silence had not been in vain. It had led him here, to a truth that would no longer be forgotten. That evening, Evelyn joined him on the porch of his apartment, the city alive with the sounds of jazz drifting in the distance. She handed him a newspaper with his story printed in full by a larger outlet that had finally decided to take the risk. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," Daniel corrected, offering a tired smile. Bobby arrived a little later, carrying a bottle of bourbon. "For the ghosts," he said, pouring 3 glasses. They drank together, the weight of the journey hanging in the air between them. Daniel raised his glass slightly, to the men who were silenced, and to the truth that finally spoke. The others nodded, and for a moment the noise of the city faded, leaving only the quiet bond between them. But even in this piece, Daniel knew the story wasn't finished. History had a way of hiding more than it revealed. The trucks in the swamp were only one chapter. There were always other silences, other stories waiting for someone willing to chase them into the dark. As he prepared for whatever came next, Daniel felt changed. He was no longer the restless journalist seeking a headline. He was a man who had carried voices across 50 years and delivered them into the present. The burden of truth was heavy, but it was a weight he chose to bear. Looking out at the glowing city skyline, he spoke quietly, almost to himself. The swamp tried to keep its secrets, but the past always finds a way back. And to the viewers listening now, if this story moved you, Subscribe for more hidden chapters of history, stories that refuse to be silenced. And don't forget to click on the video suggested on your screen to continue uncovering the untold past. Because history is never really gone. It waits in journals, in forgotten trucks, in the silence of families who still wonder. All it takes is someone willing to listen. Daniel Harris had listened, and through him, the lost convoy of 1942 would never be forgotten again.